I wanted to go over some just really basic turnout based data from the 2016 versus the 2020 election, and then look at some election maps and how those maps can, frankly, be a little misleading depending on what you're looking at. We're not used to looking at very high turnout election years, and one of the big distinguishing features from 2016 to 2020 was the increase in turnout. And we saw that for Democrats and we saw that for Republicans too. So in 2018, we talked about the blue wave. We had a lot more Democratic voters than you would expect in a midterm election. Arnon Mishkin, who runs the elections desk for Fox News, started talking about the increase in Republican turnout as a red undertow. And I think it's a useful framework here. So a lot of the stuff that we look at is, how did the margins change, the differences between the two parties from 2016 to 2020? Did Biden gain? Did Trump gain? That sort of stuff. And underneath all of that is this increase in turnout. And this is stuff, if you've worked in civic engagement world and voter registration and voter mobilization, that increase in turnout has been a long expected feature of this election. And I think it should change our perspective just a little bit on how we're looking at some of this data. So what I did here was I looked at the Cook 2020 popular vote tracker. This is the most detailed live popular vote tracker that we have. All our elections are administered locally, and then all that is aggregated at the county level, at the state level. So Dave Wasserman and the folks at the Cook Political Report are doing the most detailed job tracking all that. And even though we're about a month out from the election, the counting is not done, surprisingly. So this is data that I was poking around on. It's been updated for 2016. Daily Kos, the Progressive blog, they keep just like a long spreadsheet of all the turnout data from previous presidential elections. So I was able to just make a simple spreadsheet and compare 2016 to 2020 to see where we're at now based on the counts now. And if you go ahead and do that, you can see how much Democrats increased their votes from 2020 to 2016 and how much Republicans increased 2020 to 2016. And as you see, there's increases for both parties in every state. So you have a blue wave in Alabama, even though it's obviously not big enough to flip Alabama. There's some distinguishing states here that I'll go through. So Arizona, this was a flip for Democrats, right? California, you see that we've got 2.3 million additional votes for Democrats for Joe Biden compared to 2016, and then also an additional 1.5 million votes for Trump compared to when he ran in 2016. So that's actually, if you're just someone who cares about did more people vote for me, it's a positive story for both parties. But of course, we don't talk about how many Republicans vote for Trump in California because it doesn't make any electoral votes for them. It's a very heavily Democratic state, and that's one of the funny things about the Electoral College. Just these additional votes in California alone, if you could somehow redistribute them to swing states, then you have this huge victory for Trump, but they're stuck in California where the electoral votes are worth zero. The other distinguishing feature here is that for a really populous state like California that's very Democratic, this is where a decent chunk of Joe Biden's national popular vote lead is coming from. And we're going to see that in some other blue states too. Colorado's pretty blue now. They flipped a Senate seat. It's increasingly less competitive as a state, more and more Democratic. So Colorado, Democrats are padding their lead there too. Same deal with Connecticut. That wasn't competitive in the presidential race, but look how little Republicans gained compared to Democrats. And then, hey, hello again on the stream. Delaware, same deal, nice increase. Little DC, hey, what's up? Florida is really an exception where the red undertow is an overtow, and there's more Republican turnout in Florida rather than Democratic turnout. So Republicans were able to keep that. We knew that pretty early because they count their votes pretty fast. Georgia flipped for the Democrats. And on down the list here, what's the next interesting one? Like Kentucky, you have a slightly more of a gain for Democrats there compared to Republicans, but it's a pretty red state, so obviously not enough to make up there. Maryland, another one of these states where it wasn't competitive, Massachusetts, but it does have an effect on that big popular vote lead that Biden has at the national level, even though we don't elect the president by popular vote. Michigan, flip for the Democrats. Minnesota, that was competitive. Democrats kept that. On down and down. New Jersey, pretty padded out here. You'll notice that New York is missing. New York is missing because they're very slow at counting their votes. And I'll show you some election maps in just a minute that are funny looking because New York is very slow at counting its votes. So, and in particular, New York City. So there's a lot of Biden votes that we're still waiting on the updates for those counts. You know, like please, if you ever meet an election administrator, give them a socially distanced like elbow bump or fist bump or something. They've been working really hard under very trying circumstances, and these vote counts are just slow. They haven't gotten a lot of the support that they needed at the state level or at the federal level. But still, we successfully held this election in the middle of a pandemic. North Carolina, pretty competitive. Again, a nice bump here for the Democrats, but not enough to overcome the advantages that Republicans have in that state. Ohio, similar to Florida, more gains for Republicans compared to 2016. Oregon, padding it out. Pennsylvania, huge flip for the Democrats. South Carolina is another interesting one, right? We thought maybe we'd have a competitive Senate race there, but at least at the presidential level, a little bit more of a bump for the Democrats compared to the Republicans. Texas, another really interesting story, right? There was an outside chance maybe if you thought the Democrats had a chance of flipping Texas, um, there was a gain there, right? Is it enough to flip in a red state? Not this time. Virginia hasn't been competitive in a while, at least at the presidential level, really padding it out there. Washington State, again, padding out that big national vote popular lead in some of these already blue states. And then Wisconsin, another flip. Okay, I have a question on does Michigan going full on blue? From the looks of it, makes sense. Maybe I think one of the criticisms in 2016 was that Clinton and the Democrats didn't campaign enough in Michigan, that their folks didn't have enough resources on the ground. And in 2016, the Trump's lead there was just 10,000 votes. It was really narrow, very, very close election. A lot less close this year, right? Because you see this big Democratic bump compared to 2016 versus a smaller Republican bump. And this is interesting because we focus so much on does the state flip or not, and this is one that flipped. But both parties can also say, hey, a lot of people voted for my candidate in this race, and that's what's interesting about the popular vote too. You can say like Joe Biden got the most votes in any presidential election, and you can say Trump got the second most votes in any presidential election. It's a very, very high turnout year. Cool. So if we look at this in terms of election maps, there's different things going on with election maps that we don't always notice. So let's go through some of these. These might need to reload. So this is from the Washington Post. This is counties where turnout increased at least 7 percentage points. So they're focusing on higher turnout here, and they're looking at who had more vote growth at the county level. So one level deeper than the states. If you had more vote growth for Biden, blue pyramid, more vote growth for Trump, you get this red pyramid. So if we look at this and we zoom in a little bit, we see like, okay, there's a lot of growth here in Pennsylvania, which flipped for the Democrats. What's going on underneath that at the county level? You can see that Biden gained versus Clinton, and you can also see that Trump 2020 also gained on versus Trump 2016. So they both increased their turnout. Democrats just increased it more. There's been a lot of questions around some of these red flips in Texas and Florida, right? So is that just an increase in turnout for Republicans there, or did some of these heavily Latino counties, did we have a lot of vote switching for Trump? And we probably had some vote switching. And one of the reasons that we can interpret that is the Democrats lose a little bit at that county level compared to 2016, right? So they're down a little bit. Republicans are up a lot. Same thing with some of these Texas counties, right? So these are kind of outliers on the map. Well, this one's actually another good example where like there's a huge increase for Republicans and a very slight increase for Democrats. So it's not always, one-to-one flip. We're not going to know about the swing voters and some of that more detailed stuff until we're able to do surveys. Right now, what we have is the vote counts by geographic area. Voter turnout, very high. So this is 2020. This is compared to 2016, so a big bump in turnout. And if you look at these historical elections, you could say, oh, we've had the most turnout in 100 years. Well, we had some big differences in the electorate in 1908. There's huge disenfranchisement, right? Like, we've had women's suffrage, we've had the end of all these Jim Crow laws, and then there's modern incarnations of voter disenfranchisement that are still with us, right? So, can you really compare these electorates? A lot of people would say, you can't really compare these electorates and these turnout rates in America until you get to the 1960s and onwards, when we actually have something that is closer to more universal voting rights among that voting age population, because that voting age population, it changes a lot over time based on the expansion of civil rights and the expansion of suffrage. This is county data, geographic data, but each of these circles, represents the vote gains for each party, and then the population size is represented by these circles. So these are a little complicated, but I think at a glance, like, I like looking at these maps in part because they help us get an idea of like how populous each of these counties are. Right? Counties don't vote; people do. There's a lot of smaller counties. There's tiny blue counties here. There's tiny red counties here. Right? So that gives you a nice scaled sense of the population. And then, of course, we got a lot of people on the coasts. People like living near the water. We got a lot of big coastal cities. We got a lot of big Midwestern cities, and they're big blue cities, right? So you get that sense here too. Some cities in Texas used to be majority Republican. A lot of them have flipped Democratic too, but you get that finer sense of population here. And that's really helpful because when you look at just a county map like this, counties don't vote, people do, right? But this is the change in presidential vote margin. And this is really interesting because this was produced earlier in the election before the New York vote got counted, right? So if you zoom in on New York here, yeah, that can be a little misleading, right? Because not all the votes had been counted yet. So some of the early election day votes, those got counted very quickly. The mail votes, which were largely for Biden, because we had this big partisan split in how people chose to vote, those margins, they looked really weird. So a lot of these are just going to go back to blue as all the votes get counted over time. They already have in a lot of these maps. There's also stuff like that in Philadelphia and some of these urban counties. If you're just looking at that vote margin change as opposed to turnout versus turnout, it's like, oh, like that got a little bit redder, so it's going to show up red on this map, and that might mean that Democrats gained a little bit from a very high baseline and Republicans gained a lot from a very low baseline. So like, boop, boop, you get that kind of reaction with the data. And then again, you see Florida and Texas stand out here, like we saw on the other map that was a little more focused on turnout. This is a really complex infographic. So you gotta, you gotta like sit down with a cup of coffee and look at this thing. But this is from the Washington Post. This looks like, wind patterns, right? And they call this their winds of change graphic. So what you're looking at here is the change in the vote margin from more Democratic to more Republican. That's color, right? So that's reflected in color here. And then the change in turnout, the squiggly lines can go down or the squiggly lines can go up. And it's a really high turnout year. So everywhere like where we actually have the votes counted, the squiggly lines are going up, and some places they're going way up because turnout was huge. And I think one of the features that you see here, if you parse it out, some of our swing states are highlighted in yellow. These were states that flipped to Biden. These are also battleground states where both campaigns are campaigning hard, spending a ton of ad money, doing a bunch of voter outreach. So, they're going way up, right? Their turnout's increasing a lot and they're getting bluer. Some red places are getting, they're a little more even. So they're, you got some of these purple shadings here. You got parts of California where Republicans were able to flip a lot of the House seats back to Republican, like around Orange County, that had been flipped to Democrats in 2018. You can see they went back to voting Republican more heavily compared to 2016. And then New York again is the outlier here, just because all the data is not in when a lot of these maps got made. So these maps are going to get updated over time. If you and like I feel like for a lot of these maps, you just kind of want to leave New York out until all the votes are counted, because now look, it's the only place where the squiggly lines are going down, and that's just they're not done counting all the mail votes yet. They haven't had the resources to count all the mail votes. They were real slow when a lot of these maps got made. All right. So now this is an older map of the this is from like the 2012 election, right? So this is showing us some results at the county level, and this is really interesting because it goes into 3D. So let's see. Here's a good map. Okay, now it'll zoom in. So each bar, kind of similar to the last Washington Post thing that we looked at, each bar here is population. And this really gives you a sense, looking at it in 3D, of just how much more populous the coasts are compared to the rest of the country. And I'd include, like the not quite the Gulf Coast, but some of these parts of Texas are very populous. There's very populous parts of the Midwest. And this is just a big changeover from flatland, from the maps that we're used to looking at. Um, yeah, again, people vote. Their electoral votes get counted at the state level, but people vote, not counties. Always worth taking a look at. This is a similar map that was produced in 2016. So this is margin of victory. But again, it's scaled to population, which I think is useful. And the big outlier that people always notice here is California and Los Angeles, but some other places really stand out too as having very high populations, relatively blue populations, and I think this helps illustrate the urban rural divide in voting quite a bit too, right? So I think that's useful. But in any case, yeah, I just wanted to go over that because I think the higher turnout in this election year that is just the main distinguishing feature of this election. And now the next test for the parties is how much of this vote gets retained in subsequent elections. So the first big test of that will be in Georgia. There's these statewide runoff elections. And runoff elections, at least the way Georgia does them, the old theory with these elections was that they were done this way to suppress the vote, because you knew there'd be a big drop off in voters from the general election to the runoff, and this has favored conservatives in Georgia for a while. Does that happen this year? We'll see. Right now, the Republicans are still fighting with each other over the presidential result of the 2020 election, and Georgia getting certified for Joe Biden. So does that affect their voters? How fired up are Democrats going to be? How fired up are Republicans going to be? We just don't know. That there's almost certainly going to be some drop off from the general election from 2020. But it's a race to see how little can you mitigate the drop off among your regular voters. And then there's always a drop off with the midterms. We'll see what happens there. The usual theory is that the party that lost the presidential election surges back in the midterms. There's been some exceptions to that historically too, and I think the big thing we need to keep in mind is just like this has been a really unique historical time period. It probably will continue to be a very unique historical time period. My personal opinion, like one of the big reasons that the turnout is so high is the stakes are very high. People understand that the stakes are very high, that there's very high levels of conflict in our political system, but also think like everything has been politics for the past 4 years. Everything. The news has all been about politics. Late night evening shows have been all about politics. If you're Kanye and you want to get out there, you're running for president. That's how people are staying relevant and doing stuff that's political. And we even had, like, in the midterms in 2018, celebrities who had stayed out of this stuff, like Taylor Swift. They were like actually like I'm going to tell people to go vote and register to vote now, and everything's political. So is that going to be sustained in the Biden era? Does Trump run again? Are we not really out of the Trump era? We don't know. But this sort of extremely high, constant level of attention to politics is really unique, and that's why we get a big blue wave and a red undertow, and in Florida and a couple of these other places, a red overtow, where Republicans were able to overperform in those states. So that's it. And I saw one more thing in the chat here. Didn't know the East Coast was that blue. Yeah. I mean, like the I-95 corridor keeps getting bluer. So that's part of what's happening in Georgia. That's part of what's happening in North Carolina, to a lesser extent in South Carolina. But then, like we saw, like that east coast of Florida, that wound up being an exception. And in some of those congressional districts, there was probably some vote switching going on. There was probably also just increased turnout for both parties, but Republicans were able to increase their turnout more. Another thing in Florida, and I don't know if this is unique to Florida, but I remember reading earlier in the election cycle, Republicans were investing a lot more in voter registration and voter mobilization. And traditionally, the way that the parties thought about non-voters and increasing turnout was, if you were a Democrat, you would assume that non-voters were mostly Democratic. So if you invested more in getting people to vote, they were going to be pretty likely to come to your side, or at least more likely than the Republican side. And the rise of right populism and left populism, it hasn't flipped that script, but it's complicated it. There's non-voters who become voters, who, depending on their political perspectives, their race, their economic background, their social conditions, what they're paying attention to, those non-voters could be a lot more evenly split, right? And the Knight Foundation did a really good study about what they called the missing 100 million, the 100 million people who could vote but didn't vote in 2016, and what were they like. And a lot of non-voters are folks who just, they don't pay attention to politics. They're impoverished. They're just kind of not engaged in the system at all. But then a lot of non-voters, they do pay attention to politics. They just don't feel like they have a competitive election, or they don't trust the election system, so they don't participate. And a lot of those folks, they felt like, okay, well, I got a competitive election now. Everything's been politics 24/7 for the past 4 years. So yeah, I will go out and vote, and I will make sure my voice is heard in this election. We'll see how those new voters split, because there's also a distinction in this field between a new voter who's like someone who can vote for the first time, who's 18, 19 years old, something like that. They break pretty heavy for Democrats, but depending on who they are, where they're from, someone who's been a non-voter for many years, or sometimes people use the phrase cicada voter, someone who voted a long, long time ago, and re-engages when politics is back on the radar in a big way. you know how did they come back, and what were the differences among them? And we're not going to know, for a long time, until we can do some of these surveys. Yeah, having governors and mayors support the party, yeah, that's good. I think one of the other things we're trying to figure out, and that we won't know for a while, is how much ticket splitting people did. That there's been a theory that ticket splitting is going down. If you vote Democrat, you're just going to vote Democrat. If you vote Republican, you're just going to vote Republican. We'll see what happens. In the 2018 midterms, a lot of Republicans voted for Democratic congressional candidates, and that was a big part of how those seats got flipped. And there were also lots of Democratic voters who decided not to sit out the midterms. So Democrats did have a big blue wave, and this election in 2020, this was that blue wave getting even bigger, but then the red wave finally kicked in too. So yeah, we'll see what that drop off looks like in 2022 also. Okay, cool. So we're about 20 minutes in. It looks like the audio and the video and the setup are working well. So yeah, I'll drop a link to this stuff. I've been taking some of these videos and putting them on YouTube, and I do a podcast called Close Read, so I'll get some links going to that also. But I found myself increasingly talking about this stuff on the podcast, and without the visuals, it's a little bit harder to go over. So, and this has been a great way for me to also teach myself Tableau and internalize this data a little bit more, because I'm from Jersey and I'm a talker, and that's a big part of how I learn also. So thanks for stopping by, and thanks for chatting. Take it easy.